Pastor David Mitchell wrapped his hands around the base of the Virgin Mary statue just as the Catholic prayer group finished their Hail Mary. The bronze figure had stood in the town square for 60 years, but 3 weeks of city council meetings had finally given his Evangelical coalition the legal right to remove what they called an idol from public property. The dozen Catholics still kneeling on the grass looked up in shock as David began lifting the heavy statue from its pedestal. Margaret Santos, the elderly prayer group leader, rose to her feet with surprising speed. "You cannot take her," she said, her voice carrying across the square. David ignored her and continued working the statue loose from its mounting. "This is a Christian nation, not a Catholic one," he muttered, feeling the bronze give way. His own congregation of 40 families had voted unanimously to support the removal. The statue came free just as Margaret reached him. As David lifted the sacred figure above his head, preparing to load it into his pickup truck, something impossible happened. Tears began streaming from the bronze eyes of the Virgin Mary. Not moisture or condensation, but actual tears that caught the afternoon sunlight and fell onto David's upturned face. The Catholic prayer group gasped and fell to their knees. David stood frozen, the weeping statue still in his hands, as more evangelicals from his church arrived to witness what no theology textbook had prepared them to explain. Word spread through both churches before David could even drive home with the still weeping statue secured in his truck bed. His wife, Susan, met him in the driveway, her face pale with worry and something else he couldn't identify. "The Catholics are calling it a miracle," she said quietly. "Our people are saying you staged it somehow." David carried the bronze figure into his garage, where it continued producing tears that pooled on his concrete floor. He had served as pastor of Grace Community Church for 12 years, built his reputation on sound biblical doctrine and opposition to Catholic practices he considered unscriptural. Now his own congregation was questioning whether he had somehow rigged the statue with hidden tubes or moisture devices. The phone rang constantly. News crews from 3 counties away wanted interviews. Margaret Santos stood outside his house with 5 other Catholic women, praying the rosary and asking for the statue's return. His church elders demanded an emergency meeting to discuss damage control for what they assumed was either an elaborate hoax or demonic deception. But David knew what he had felt when those bronze tears hit his face. No special effects could explain the warmth that had flooded through him, or the way his hands had trembled not with effort, but with an inexplicable reverence. Something sacred had happened in that town square, something that challenged everything he had been taught about Catholic idolatry and Protestant superiority. The emergency church meeting was interrupted by David's phone buzzing with a text from Susan at the hospital. "Emma's fever is 105. They're running more tests." His 16-year-old daughter had been fighting what doctors initially called a virus for 10 days, but her condition was rapidly deteriorating despite antibiotics and 4 fluids. David tried to focus as his board of elders debated whether the weeping statue was supernatural deception or an elaborate Catholic plot. Elder Tom Patterson paced the fellowship hall, insisting they needed to publicly denounce the incident before it damaged their church's reputation. "We cannot be associated with Catholic mysticism," Tom declared, his voice echoing off the walls lined with Bible verses about false idols. Meanwhile, Margaret Santos had organized a prayer vigil in the town square where the empty pedestal stood. Word had spread to neighboring Catholic parishes, and dozens of families now gathered each evening to pray for the statue's return and for understanding between the divided churches. Local news crews filmed their peaceful demonstrations while interviewing evangelical leaders who called the tears either fraud or demonic manifestation. But David's mind was elsewhere. As Emma's temperature climbed past 106 degrees and her blood work showed alarming abnormalities that baffled the medical team, he found himself remembering the inexplicable warmth he had felt when those bronze tears touched his face. Could the same power that moved through that statue also heal his daughter? Emma's condition worsened through the night. The pediatric team at Regional Medical Center ran every test they could think of, but her white blood cell count continued dropping while her fever remained dangerously high. Dr. Martinez spoke in careful medical terms about possible autoimmune responses and rare viral infections, but David could see the worry in his eyes. Susan hadn't left their daughter's bedside in 36 hours. She held Emma's burning hand and whispered prayers that seemed to bounce off the hospital room ceiling without reaching heaven. "We've prayed for healing," she said to David when he brought coffee and hospital cafeteria sandwiches. Why isn't God answering? The question haunted him during the drive home to shower and check on the statue. In his garage, the bronze Virgin Mary continued weeping, the small puddle of tears now covering several square feet of concrete floor. David knelt beside it, feeling foolish but desperate. His evangelical training screamed that this was idolatry, that prayer should go directly to Jesus, never through Mary or any other intermediary. But Emma was dying. The specialists had no answers. His own prayers felt powerless against whatever was consuming his daughter's immune system. As he stared at the weeping face of the Virgin Mary, David Mitchell found himself wondering if his theological certainty had blinded him to sources of divine power he had spent 12 years teaching his congregation to reject. At 3 a.m, Dr. Martinez called David and Susan into the hallway outside Emma's room. "Her organs are beginning to shut down," he said quietly. "We've exhausted our treatment options. You should call your family." David stared through the window at his daughter, who looked impossibly small surrounded by machines and tubes. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Susan collapsed into a chair and began sobbing uncontrollably. The sound echoed through the empty hospital corridors like a prayer of desperation. His phone buzzed with messages from church members offering to organize more prayer circles. But David knew they had been praying nonstop for 4 days without any improvement. Pastor Jim from a Methodist church had visited. The Catholic priest, Father Rodriguez, had quietly asked permission to pray in Emma's room, but David had refused, citing denominational differences even as his daughter slipped closer to death. Now, facing the very real possibility of losing Emma within hours, David felt his theological walls crumbling. His systematic theology textbooks offered no comfort. His seminary training provided no miraculous healing techniques. As he stood in that sterile hospital hallway, watching his wife weep and his daughter die, David Mitchell realized that his evangelical certainty meant nothing if it couldn't save the person he loved most in the world. David left Susan at Emma's bedside and drove home through the empty streets at 4 a.m. In his garage, the Virgin Mary statue continued its inexplicable weeping, the bronze tears gleaming under the fluorescent light. For the first time in his pastoral career, David Mitchell got on his knees, not in his church sanctuary, but on the cold concrete floor beside what he had been taught to call an idol. "Mary," he whispered, feeling the words burn his throat like blasphemy. "I don't understand this. I don't understand you. But Emma is dying and nothing else is working." The admission felt like tearing up his seminary diploma, abandoning everything he had preached about salvation through Christ alone. His voice broke as he continued. "If you can hear me, if you can really intercede for us, please ask Jesus to heal my daughter. I know I tried to take you away. I know I called you names and taught others to reject you. But Emma is innocent. She's 16 years old, and she's never hurt anyone." Tears mixed with the statue's mysterious moisture on the garage floor. David had built his ministry on intellectual certainty, on systematic theology that explained away Catholic practices as unscriptural superstition. Now, stripped of pride and desperate beyond theological boundaries, he found himself begging the Mother of God for the miracle that conventional medicine and evangelical prayer had failed to provide. David's phone rang at 6:30 that morning while he was still kneeling beside the statue. Susan's voice was breathless with confusion and hope. "David, you need to get back here right now. Something's happening with Emma." He drove to the hospital faster than he had ever driven in his life, praying fragments of thanksgiving mixed with disbelief. In Emma's room, Dr. Martinez stood studying her chart with 3 other specialists, their faces showing the bewilderment of medical professionals confronting something that defied explanation. "Her fever broke an hour ago," Dr. Martinez said, shaking his head. "Her white blood cell count is normalizing. Her organ function is improving by the minute." "I've never seen anything like this." Emma was sitting up in bed for the first time in days, her color returning to normal, asking Susan for real food instead of hospital broth. David took his daughter's hand, feeling the normal warmth of healthy circulation instead of the burning fever that had consumed her for nearly a week. The machines that had been keeping her alive were now showing readings that made the medical team question their original diagnosis. Susan looked at her husband with wonder and something that might have been understanding. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. David glanced toward the window, where he could see the town square and the empty pedestal in the distance. "I asked for help," he said simply, knowing that his entire theological worldview had just been shattered by an answered prayer he never should have believed was possible. Emma came home 3 days later with a clean bill of health that baffled every specialist who had treated her. The medical team could find no trace of the mysterious illness that had nearly killed her, no explanation for her sudden recovery, except what Dr. Martinez carefully termed a spontaneous remission of unknown etiology. David sat in his study, surrounded by theology books that suddenly felt inadequate. For 12 years, he had preached that Catholic veneration of Mary was dangerous idol worship, that prayers should go directly to Jesus without any human intermediary. Yet his daughter was alive because he had broken every rule he had taught his congregation. Susan found him there at midnight, staring at his seminary textbook on Protestant systematic theology. "She's really okay, isn't she?" Susan said, settling into the chair across from his desk. David nodded, then looked up at his wife with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and theological confusion. "I prayed to Mary," he admitted quietly. "When everything else failed, when the doctors gave up, when our prayers seemed to hit the ceiling, I got on my knees in that garage and asked her to intercede for Emma." Susan was quiet for a long moment. "And Emma got better," she said simply. The implications terrified him. If Mary could intercede for healing, if the Catholic understanding of her role had validity, then everything he had built his ministry on needed serious reconsideration. His daughter's life had been saved by theology he had spent years condemning. David called Father Rodriguez on a Thursday afternoon, his hands shaking as he dialed the Catholic Church office. "I need to understand something," he said when the priest answered. "About Mary. About intercession. About what happened to my daughter." They met at a coffee shop outside town, where neither congregation would recognize them. Father Rodriguez was a gentle man in his 60s who had served St. Anthony's Parish for 20 years. He listened without judgment as David described Emma's illness, his desperate prayer, and her miraculous recovery. "You're struggling with the theology of it," Father Rodriguez said kindly. David nodded, admitting that everything he had been taught about Catholic practices suddenly seemed inadequate to explain his daughter's healing. The priest opened his worn Bible to Luke's Gospel and read about Mary's visit to Elizabeth, how the unborn John the Baptist leaped in his mother's womb at Mary's greeting. "She's not a goddess, David. We don't worship her, but she is the Mother of God, and her intercession is powerful because of her unique relationship with Jesus. Think of it like asking a friend to pray for you. Except this friend gave birth to our Savior and stands closer to the throne of grace than any other human being." David felt something shift in his understanding. Not idol worship, but intercessory prayer through someone whose connection to Jesus was more intimate than anyone else's. His evangelical training had taught him to fear Catholic practices, but sitting across from this wise priest, he began to see how Marian devotion could deepen rather than threaten his relationship with Christ. The following Sunday, David stood before his evangelical congregation with the Virgin Mary statue positioned beside the pulpit. Some members gasped, others whispered angrily, but he raised his hand for silence before anyone could leave. 3 weeks ago, I tried to remove this statue because I believed it represented idol worship. He began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. My daughter Emma was dying of an illness that baffled every specialist. Our prayers seemed powerless against her condition. He described kneeling in his garage, humbling himself before what he had called an idol, and asking Mary to intercede for Emma's healing. When I prayed to the Mother of our Lord, asking her to bring our petition to Jesus, Emma began recovering immediately. The medical team has no explanation except miraculous intervention. Half the congregation sat in stunned silence. Elder Tom Patterson stood up and walked out, shaking his head in disgust. But others leaned forward, listening intently as their pastor described how Catholic understanding of Marian intercession had saved his daughter's life. "I'm not becoming Catholic," David continued, "but I'm no longer going to condemn practices that clearly have God's blessing. Mary heard my prayer and brought it to her son, just as she might bring yours." Margaret Santos sat in the back pew, tears streaming down her face as she watched an evangelical pastor publicly acknowledge the power of Marian intercession. After the service, she approached David with quiet dignity and asked if the statue could return to the town square, where both communities could honor the Mother of Jesus together. The statue returned to the town square on a crisp October morning, but this time both Protestant and Catholic families gathered for the rededication ceremony. David stood beside Father Rodriguez as they blessed the pedestal together, their combined prayers representing a unity that their denominations had rarely experienced. Some evangelical families left Grace Community Church after David's public testimony about Marian intercession, but others stayed and began asking questions about Catholic practices they had never understood. Susan started attending Father Rodriguez's Bible study on Mary in Scripture, discovering theological depth she had never explored in her Protestant education. Emma, now completely healthy and back in school, became an unofficial bridge between the two youth groups. She organized joint service projects where Protestant and Catholic teenagers worked together at the food bank and nursing home, their shared faith in Jesus overcoming generations of denominational suspicion. David began hosting monthly interfaith dinners where families from both churches gathered to discuss their common beliefs and honest differences. These conversations were sometimes difficult, but they were always rooted in mutual respect and a shared experience of witnessing divine intervention through Mary's intercession. The weeping statue never wept again after Emma's healing, but it became a symbol of unity rather than division. Parents from both congregations brought their sick children to pray beneath it, and more than one family experienced answers to prayers that transcended denominational boundaries. The Virgin Mary had become not a source of conflict, but a reminder that God's grace flows through unexpected channels to those humble enough to receive it. 2 years later, David's ministry had evolved into something he never could have imagined. His office walls displayed both Protestant Reformation texts and Catholic writings on Marian theology, representing a theological journey that began with prejudice and ended with profound respect for the Mother of God. Families traveled from neighboring counties to hear the evangelical pastor who openly taught about Marian intercession while maintaining his Protestant identity. His congregation had grown to include former Catholics who appreciated his biblical approach to Mary's role, and Protestants who had discovered deeper dimensions of their faith through understanding her intercession. Emma, now 18 and preparing for college, often spoke at youth conferences about how her near-death experience had transformed not just her father's ministry, but an entire community's understanding of Christian unity. Her medical records remained a mystery that doctors still discussed at conferences, but her family knew the source of her healing. The Virgin Mary statue in the town square had become a pilgrimage site for families facing medical crises. David and Father Rodriguez took turns offering counseling and prayer for desperate parents who arrived seeking the same miraculous intervention that had saved Emma's life. On quiet evenings, David sometimes stood before that bronze figure and marveled at how divine grace had shattered his theological pride to save his daughter's life. Mary had not asked him to abandon his Protestant faith, but to expand it beyond the boundaries of denominational fear. Have you ever experienced healing that challenged everything you thought you knew about God? Share your story of unexpected grace in the comments. because sometimes the most powerful prayers come through the most surprising sources.